For those who are just coming in, welcome everyone. We're gonna wait till 5 past, till there's some, allow people to join. Hi, everyone. Welcome everybody to this special online event of Foam in collaboration with Aperture, celebrating the legacy of Ernest Cole. My name is Winke Wiegersma, Curator of Digital Programs at Foam, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all on this, for me, quite lovely evening in Amsterdam, but for you, probably all around the globe. I'm excited to see so many of you joining. We are here on the occasion of Ernest Cole, House of Bondage, the exhibition currently on show at Foam in Amsterdam until June 14th. Before we start, I'm gonna share some household announcement. This event is recorded. Feel free to turn your camera off if you don't want to be filmed. We ask all participants to please mute themselves during the event. During the event, you can post all your questions in the chat. Please don't hold back. At the end, there will be time for a Q&A session, and we'll come back to your questions and hope to answer most of them. The order of today will be, after my introduction, we'll start with an introduction by Hinde Haast of the research that was done for the exhibition at Foam, followed by the conversation with our lovely special guest, Leslie Matlaisane, Oluremi Onabanjo, and Denise Wolf. I will continue now to introduce our moderator for the evening, Hinde Haast. Hinde is currently Curator of Photography at Rijksmuseum Amsterdam, and before was Curator at Foam, and in that position curated the current exhibition about Cole's legacy and work. But before I'm handing over to Hinde, let's hear a few words from Ernest Cole himself. The video that we will play now, it's approximately 4 minutes, is an excerpt from Images for Millions, Photography as a Social Weapon, Louis Hine and Ernest Cole, by Ruun Hasner, made in 1967.
Well, it all started at the end of 1956. I had just finished my second year in high school, And instead of going further, as I had decided to become a doctor, I decided to leave school because the government had deliberately lowered the already low standard of education for Africans with what they call the the introduction of the Bantu Education Act. So I decided this was going a little bit too far, and I left and decided to finish my schooling by correspondence. I was also interested in taking up photography by correspondence. Then, of course, it took me a year before I could get a break as a darkroom assistant. So in about May 1958, I got my first break through a young German photographer, Jürgen Schaderberg, on a drum magazine. And because drum was in Johannesburg, which is 2.5 hours away from my hometown, I had to read my lessons on the train, correspondence course, I mean. It was then also that I met a lot of Africans who themselves were very concerned about what was going on in South Africa at the time. It was also then that I became aware of the existence of the United Nations and the Afro-Asian Bloc, which of course was strongly attacking South Africa in that year. So then I decided I could help the Afro-Asian Bloc and the outside world by photographing the conditions in South Africa, the everyday life of the people there. And I wasn't quite sure what form my work was going to take, but later in 1959 I saw my first photographic book, which was entitled People of Moscow by Cartier-Bresson, the French photographer. So then I decided, well, this is the form I wanted my work to take. And slowly I started documenting, just to show what life was really like in South Africa. I was, of course, aware that after finishing it, it wouldn't be possible to remain in South Africa, but then I didn't care, because this is a chance you take, and all of us have taken. You don't want, to live under those miserable conditions. I was, of course, very naive when I started out, because I thought, being so far away, in South Africa, being so isolated, that all the noise that the United Nations was leading somewhere, in other words, that they were going to step in and bring about some change. But in coming away from South Africa, I found out that South Africa really was just one of the topics on the United Nations agenda, and that it was up to us there to really bring about change. But as I say, I don't know what purpose this work has served, but I think it could be useful, even if it's not for the United Nations, but for our children. It's evidence. It's of course not possible for them to see it. The book now, as it cannot be distributed there because I've been banned in absentia, so which means anything I say cannot be quoted or written in the newspapers. But that doesn't matter. It'll stand, in the future, because I'm sure South Africa will be free.
That's my cue. Yeah, I'm just going to give a brief introduction of the exhibition, but before I do, I just want to share with you the first time I saw this video of Cole talking about his own work. It really struck me, because he was already he'd already left South Africa. He had already been banned for publishing House of Bondage. But I expected a very sort of angered and vicious person when I looked at his photographs for the first time. And then here you see a slightly shy, very eloquent, and very, very determined young man talking about his own work. in such clear terms. And it really struck me how much of a personal sacrifice he was knowingly and willingly taking by publishing House of Bondage, and knowing that he would not be able to go back to his home country. This sort of also formed the premise for curating the show, because Cole didn't only talk about his own work very eloquently, but he also wrote about it in his book. So a lot of the text in the show, but also the selection of works, kind of follow this narrative that he constructed. So I'm going to share some installation views just to give you an idea of what it looks. I hope I'm sharing the right screen this time. Can you all see it? Yeah. So yeah, we literally start with the book, and the exhibition sort of follows the narrative thread of the 14 chapters that Cole himself chose to highlight. First one being the mines, which is actually his very first commission as a photographer. I mean, he started, you heard him speak about Drum magazine in the little video. He started as a darkroom assistant in '58 at the age of 18. And sort of for this one feature for Drum about the African mines, he subbed for another photojournalist. And well, he did the feature on the mines, but actually felt that it wasn't critical enough. I mean, Drum magazine was, like many other magazines, also dependent, and the whole South African economy dependent on income from the mines at Witwatersrand, and was also not really allowed to be as critical as they wanted to be. So Cole decided to return to the mines various times, sneaking in basically, because he could literally just sort of disappear in the worker crowds, because he himself was a Black freelance photographer, and he would photograph. Oral history goes from a lunch bag that he poked a hole in, and he would take his pictures from there. And what I found so striking about all of the sort of chapters in his book is that they don't only tell the story of, you know, Black life or Black labor as a basis for South African society under apartheid, but also can be read sort of autobiographically. So here we see the chapter about called Black Spots, about the relocation of settlements or towns with Black South African inhabitants to increase sort of white residential areas, as well as the pass laws that were in effect, obligating Black South Africans to carry around identification wherever they went, and obstructing them or barring them from certain areas. And this, I mean, this resettlement happened to the Cole family when Cole was 21 years old himself. They were relocated to Mamelodi, which proved to be a very traumatizing event for him, and the inspiration or the basis of his chapter Black Spots in the book. The pass laws he actually cleverly circumvented by having himself reclassified from Black to colored, which meant that he, as a freelance photographer, was able to access certain places that regular or other Black South Africans could not. But still, because he himself was a man of color, he could, as I said, kind of blur or merge into daily life and really show what was happening from within. And this was a unique position, and I think a unique contribution of his to photography under apartheid. I mean, there were more photographers doing this work, David Goldblatt being a very famous example, but the way Ernest Cole did it from a very sort of daily life perspective as a Black man is really incredibly unique. This is another example of how his own lived experience fed into his photography. So we see a segregated train platform. He was daily commuting back and forth to his office that he shared with Struan Robertson at some point, or to the editorial offices of Drum or Rand Daily Mail, where he was at some point also working. And he himself was subject to these crowded trains and segregated platforms, which was a bizarre situation, which he recorded very powerfully in this image, for example. I'm not going to go through all of the chapters, there are 14, but just sort of highlighting some that, yeah, I think really speak to the way he approached photography. This is a very powerful layout that's actually we reproduced in the exhibition that was taken as, from a spread of the book, which shows how language and apartheid signage was really permeating everyday life and the streets and the public spaces of South Africa, and how this completely sort of normalized racial segregation in the public space and in the public realm. And Cole was very concerned about this when it came to education and youth and upbringing, because, well, he spoke about the video about Bantu education. He dropped out of school as soon as this was segregated education was implemented because Black South Africans were only really educated for manual labor. He didn't see the point of this, so he enrolled in a sort of course, like a correspondence course, which he took on from a distance. And here you see a very powerful image of a nanny, a Black nanny who is minding a white child, which is a very tender and loving image of coexistence, but also speaks about how racism is internalized from a very young age and becomes completely normalized by exposing children to this system from a very young age. The exhibition also includes contact sheets, which the Ernest Cole Family Trust very generously let us reproduce from the archive, showing here, for example, the boy Papa, who he followed around. Again, sort of, exposing how apartheid and the lack of chances for Black children perpetuated racial segregation. But it also allows us a glimpse into how he was dancing around his subject, how he behaved on the street, which images he picked for his book, and which images did not make the cut. It has also allowed us to date and place different images which we didn't really know enough about. So it's a really rich source of information for researchers, I think in the future as well, who are curating or researching the work of Cole. And an incredibly fun also to show in the exhibition, because visitors are really starting to come closer to his working method. Here we see a few examples. One of the mines, and the other one is of the right hand one is of the nannies who are having sort of social gatherings outside on the lawn of their boss's property, because they weren't allowed to entertain inside the house they were living. So they had to revert to the public space. But again, you see kind of the different, like the unfolding situation and the decisions that that Cole made while photographing. We also included his own words in the form of handwritten notes, which he took of his visit to various schools under Bantu education. And they're incredible sources of information as well about his thoughts on education under apartheid. And there, in the archives, there was a huge amount of newspaper clippings, which we assume he gathered himself and kept, which we could add with our own research, also with magazines from the Netherlands, from the UK, from the US. And it really struck me as I was doing this research how incredibly wide the reach of House of Bondage was when it was first published. I mean, it was all over the news abroad and outside of South Africa. It sold out like within months, and it had a huge impact on foreign public opinion about South Africa. And you can really read that in these, these Dutch magazines that I found. This one's Katholieke Illustratie. And yeah, also in Drum magazine he published. But these images are much less critical of the apartheid regime, obviously, because you couldn't just publish whatever you wanted. And these images talk more about the coexistence of Black and white South Africans, which, in House of Bondage, it was much more of a critique. And in this Dutch newspaper magazine I found, which is actually from '62, so that's quite early and before the publication of House of Bondage and the media attention that Cole received, his work made its way to into the Dutch media already quite early on. And this led me to research some press archives, in which I also found some images of Cole that were distributed in distribution sets by various press agencies. One is Magnum, but also United Press, ABC Press, and others. Theo Photographer in Sweden were distributing his images in these sets. And the back of the image really gives a lot of information about the caption, the original caption, with which it was intended to be distributed, but also where this image was published. So there's all these stamps from different magazines that actually published this particular image. These images are also part of the exhibition. So, and this is also a kind of, I think, a call for archives and curators and researchers in your respective countries to start digging, because I don't know about other countries, but in the Netherlands, his work was quite widely distributed at the time. And I feel like a lot still remains to be excavated. One of the interesting things about the exhibition is that we were allowed by the Ernest Cole Family Trust to include some work that Cole had done in the United States when he went into banishment in '66, before the publication of House of Bondage. First, he traveled around Europe, went to Sweden, where the video was recorded, and he had his first solo show, also curated by Rune Hastner. But then he ended up in the United States, where he died eventually in 1990. And he actually photographed there extensively on the streets of New York. For example, this image was taken there. And he was interviewed in the New York Times, this article, and he speaks about how his experience, he was kind of disillusioned by his move to the US. He found a similar racial inequality as he had experienced in South Africa. And was actually not given the opportunities that he thought he would upon arrival. He received a grant from the Ford Foundation to photograph the American South, so he also did some images there. But he ended up quite impoverished, sometime on and off on the street, living on the streets. And he died kind of losing grip of his archive and died of cancer just a week or so, or a few days after Nelson Mandela was released from prison. So this really sort of made me look at the work from the States in another way. And this is just a sample of things that were found when in 2017, all 60,000 of his negatives from the States and also from House of Bondage were found in a Swedish bank and handed over to the Ernest Cole Family Trust. And these are all images that had never been seen, never been shown, and they're included in the show as a slideshow because we don't know any vintage print exist. We only have these scans that were done by the University of Witwatersrand. And they show a sort of relentless concern for Black lives and the sort of Black experience and identity, but with a focus on the problems that we're facing in the United States. So we're looking at, the sexual revolution, but also the civil rights movement or the wake of the civil rights movement. We're looking at queer and gay rights. We're looking at here, these are images taken in the American South, which was still very, well, not segregated officially, but yeah, the opportunities for Black Americans were very slim, which he also managed to capture, even in color, which I never knew he did. And these images are really, really, I find, vibrant celebrations of Black identity. He almost becomes a sort of street photographer in these images, and they're really sort of add a different level to the work of Cole that we know, or that has been known for a long time. And I'm really grateful to the Ernest Cole Family Trust to allow us to sort of dig into this, uncovered archive and and show all of this material and also this archival material, which kind of deepens our understanding of this person. And I want to sort of stop sharing my my slideshow now and invite Leslie with me, because Leslie Matlaisane is the director of the Ernest Cole Family Trust, as well as the nephew of Ernest Cole. So it's you're the closest thing so far that I found to Cole. And it's really nice to have you here and be able to talk to you. Leslie, do you have your mic on?
Am I muted?
Yes, I can hear you. Perfect. I just wanted to ask you a few questions. I mean, firstly, I don't know how old you were when Cole left South Africa, but do you have any personal memories or anecdotes or family histories that you can share with us about, your uncle?
Oh yes, of course. I was still very young. I think when he left, I was just about to turn 6 years old. A month before I turned 6 years old. So he left on the 9th of May, 1966, and my birthday is 9th of June, 9th. So he left 30 days before my 60th birthday. And he was very close to my mother. He used to come almost every second day to come and check my mother. And he took lots of photographs of us as well. Me together with my siblings, we had five boys and one girl. So and he left quite a number of photographs for us that he took, which of course I was hoping to find in the archive, but unfortunately they're not there. I found other, photographs that he took of us when we were very young in Mamelodi. Yes, I was still very young at the time.
And do you, I mean, you're talking about photographs that you found in the archive. I mean, these were, you're referring to the archive that was found in a Swedish bank, right? In Stockholm in 2017.
Correct. Yes, correct.
Can you tell us, I mean, this is incredible, right? That so many years, decades later, this huge number of negatives, letters, you know, notes, contact sheets resurface in this Swedish vault. How like, were you contacted about this? Can you kind of walk us through what happened when you got the news and what you kind of found when you went there?
Okay, well, at first I kind of received an email from Gunilla Knappe requesting a meeting in a month's time because some material, lots of material of Ernest Cole has been found in a bank, and he wants to come with a lawyer so that they can, you know, prove the actual inheritors of Ernest Cole. And at first, I was not comfortable to share, you know, any information or exchange any information with them. And I kind of resisted them, and I asked lots of questions until, you know, the advocate who actually was appointed by the District Court of Stockholm as an administrator of Ernest Cole estate, you know, gave me a call to explain the purpose of the meeting. And it's then that I then opened up and started sharing with them, you know, the family tree, and so on, who's alive, who's not alive in the family tree. And then the meeting then took place in Pretoria at the attorney's firm where the you know, the Ernest Cole Family Trust was actually formed. So in that meeting, also the advocate wanted to also check if Ernest Cole was a citizen of South Africa or not. And with the help of the attorney there, and it was discovered that he was no longer a citizen. He was stripped his citizenship shortly after House of Bondage was published in 1967. So then he had to dig more to figure out his actual citizenship so that he can decide on which interstate law to apply in order to, you know, administer the estate. So yes, and then we continue to exchange information until he, you know, finished the process, and then I was then invited to Sweden to come and collect the archive, and we went there, and then he took us to the bank where three, you know, boxes were actually put on the table. And then when the first one fell open, you know, I was so excited. You know, it was amazing to see, you know, what he photographed and how, you know, connected he was to those moments. You know, if I had to describe it, you know, it was like when Simba, as you know, was you know, lifted by the shaman baboon Rafiki. You know, it was really a very exciting moment to see 60,000 American photographs neatly, you know, filed in beautiful files. You know, it was amazing.
Do we know who made the deposit or who filed the work?
Unfortunately, up until today, it's still a mystery. We're still doing research to figure out who did deposit, because according to the bank officials, they do not have any information as to who deposited and as to who was paying. And they are not even quite sure for how long the material has been in the bank.
Yeah. And then the next sort of mission, if you have these huge amount of really incredible material, you know, falling into your lap, is what do you do with it? I mean, you've had them scanned and organized for the past years, which is why it took a while on top of COVID before they could actually be shown. But yeah, I guess my question is, what do you hope for this archive to bring? Like, what are your future plans with the archive?
Well, the future plan obviously is to preserve the archive and also to you know, use the archive to promote the legacy of Ernest Cole so that it can be appreciated by you know, generations to come, you know, so that it can be, you know, used for reference when history is rewritten, you know, 100 years from now. You know, that's basically, you know, our hope that we can also, you know, use the material to share with the world, you know, what Ernest Cole documented in South Africa, what he documented in America, especially in America, because that's never before seen the material of Ernest Cole. But obviously, equally important, we want to bring Ernest Cole back to South Africa because he is little known in his own country up until today. So we are also hoping to do a big, you know, exhibition in South Africa, including both, you know, his South African work as well as the American work. Also, we are working very hard to you know, do a documentary on Ernest Cole, you know, using the archive. We've made quite good progress so far. The documentary was recently, you know, announced at the Cannes Film Festival recently, which is good news, you know,
Yeah.
for the Trust.
When will we be able to see it?
Hopefully, beginning of 2024. The documentary will start hitting the screens. So the rights has been acquired by two companies. One of them will focus on North America and one of them on the international market.
Great. Well, that sounds very promising. And I think we all look forward to seeing more of the iceberg, of which this exhibition is only the tip. And, you know, one of the initiatives that you also took as head of the Trust was to publish with Aperture 2 publications. One was the reissuing of House of Bondage in a sort of tweaked form. And the other was to publish for the first time the color work and the American work. So I want to invite actually Denise Wolf, who is editor at Aperture, to now share her presentation of you know, thank you, Leslie, by the way, sorry, to sort of share her experience and the process of publishing these two volumes, and yeah, to give us a bit more insight into that process. Denise, take it away.
Well, you've both covered a lot of ground, and it has been a long road, and Leslie's been on this journey with us for a few years right now. And as you've said, it's a landmark book, House of Bondage. And so we really were very careful and thoughtful about how we reissue something that is quite famous. And I'm going to show you a little bit of behind the scenes of that. One of the things we did was to commission a lament by Mangone Wale Sorote, who's the poet laureate of South Africa and also had known Cole in New York. And I think when we're talking about the book in terms of design, it's really easy to separate yourself from the content or distance yourself, but we really tried to stay present in the work as we were working on it. And this quote from the lament really sums up, I think, what we were trying to achieve. Why is oppression and abject exploitation of human beings by other human beings so persistent and relentless? House of Bondage poses this question once more to humanity. And he talks about how House of Bondage itself was an indictment of humanity. And it's really difficult material. And I think we were all affected by that, as well as just the enormity of the content was just how well known this book was in photo book history and publishing history. And so really trying to figure out how to reissue that for an audience today, and also taking into consideration some of the materials that were found in that 2017 cache of negatives. This is the original book that had this kind of time life 1970s look to the cover. It was using the printer's blocks with House of Bondage. It had that old South African flag. And then you would open, and the end papers had this first image that was right on the end papers of the train tracks that Hinda had talked about earlier. And we knew we did not want to use this cover and this flag. And so we wanted to redo how we did this. This is our cover, which uses the block. And instead of making the kind of negative of the House of Bondage letters, we use a positive of that, and you can see the black box around it. And then our end papers are actually the contact sheet of that particular image, because we use that image in the book, which I'll show you. We commissioned new texts to speak to a more contemporary audience. First, the Lament by Sorote, which is a really beautiful and powerful kind of sustained questioning about why we're looking at this now and what it means. And then, of course, Oloremi Anabanjo's beautiful text about the legacy of House of Bondage as a book and a body of work. We also had a text by James Sanders about Cole's life. And then those are kind of on the exterior of the main part of the book. We wanted to keep House of Bondage itself and all of Cole's writings and his layout completely intact. And so we use that end paper from the first edition kind of open, where everything is exactly the same. So this is all of Cole's writing as he wrote it. Were some typos and things in it. We didn't fix those. We left things exactly as they were. The layout is exactly as it is. The captioning is how it is. Everything is the same. I'm not going to show you the whole book, but just to give you a sense of how this kind of center of the book was almost a facsimile of the original edition. This is kind of coming toward the end of that edition. And then this was the end papers that Hinda also talked about with all of the signs. That was the back end paper of the book. And then we decided to add a new chapter in the book, because there were loads of things that he had marked on his contact sheets that weren't published, including kind of 2 extra chapters on religion. And then there was this folder on Black ingenuity. And if you can read on the right, these are on the left was where his negatives were. On the right, I think, was his contact sheets. And you can see in his handwriting, he says, remnants of everything, of joy, of peace and harmony, of culture, of creativity, and of all the things they failed to stamp out. And he had these kind of descriptions and writings for each chapter. And so we felt like this was an intact chapter that he ultimately chose not to publish in the edition, but we thought now would be a good time to add that. And you can see he chose some of the images for it, again, looking at those contact sheets that really guided us in how to put this chapter together, because of course there's no captions in this chapter. He never wrote it. So we didn't include captions, but we did include some of the pictures he chose. And we felt that he was very deliberate in focusing on Black cultural production. And specifically, it's not just a musician playing, it's a musician composing. And so there's a sense of agency in these photographs. This mainly centers around Dorkey House in Johannesburg. You can also see music lessons, acting. And again, it's not just acting, it's directing. And so really getting a sense of that agency within cultural production that was happening. I'm not showing everything from it, but it's also Black audiences. You can see, and we ended the book on dancing. So this was an added chapter that came kind of outside. I thought it might be interesting to look at a few covers that didn't make it. And Leslie, some of these, I don't even know if I showed you. Some of them didn't even make that cut. But this was one that we had looked at, and it was some pictures from the images that were found that weren't in the House of Bondage. But I always really liked this one, but since it wasn't an original picture, we decided not to go this direction. We also looked at maybe we should do a contact sheet. What would that look like? And this is also a really interesting direction. But ultimately we decided that it wasn't right. It felt like it was for a film or a novel. And what I have failed to mention is that this is designed by Oliver Barstow. He's a South African designer who at the time was residing in Amsterdam, but now has moved to Italy. And we really felt it was very important to work with someone who was South African and who would understand the project, but also the importance of that photo book. And since Oliver had also been a partner in Fourth Wall Publishing, which is a photo book publisher in South Africa, we thought he would be an amazing choice, and he turned out to be an amazing choice. This is to show you that we tried a bit of color on that cover, and it just really didn't read right. So we ended up with a fully black and white cover, and this is where we ended. And Remy writes really beautifully about this particular image, and I know she's going to talk a little bit about it, so I won't go into it, but we really felt like it spanned the difference between a historical image and also looking toward the future, and worked really well on the cover of House of Bondage. And so we just, in the end, felt like it had the kind of packaging that referenced the older edition and was respectful to it, but also brought in some new elements that would speak to audiences today. So we're really happy with this. And this was the first time it was published for the first time in South Africa, which was our main focus in launching the book, really making sure that we started there. I also wanted to give you just a little bit more of a preview, and I'll go through these pretty quickly, about some of the American work. We are working on this book, which we named The True America after this picture. As Hinda said, these negatives were thought to be lost if they even existed, but there were 40,000 of them just in the United States. All the photographs are dated between 1967 and 1972. He certainly could have been more. We don't know if we're looking at a complete archive or what exactly this was, so we're just working with what's there. He photographed predominantly in New York, and what you're looking at here are photographs of Harlem, where he lived on 142nd Street for most of the time that he was photographing during this time period. And he was really looking at Harlem as a community. He had gotten that Ford Foundation grant to look at both rural Black communities and city communities. And so Harlem was his main focus, and you can see he's got the fly shop. This is really important. This was associated with Kwame Brathwaite, A-Jazz, and other movements that were happening in Harlem. Here's a little self-portrait he did. You can see it's not all kind of happy, but he has this amazing sense of humor where he's capturing, of course, those signs where he's got the church in the background in Harlem, and also these roaches and rats signs at the same time. Really, just like in South Africa, this focus on signs, but also looking at people within his community. We found within the negatives that he had attended Harlem on My Mind, the Met Museum exhibition in 1969. Is this still advancing? So we felt like that he was very interested. He must have crossed those picket lines. It was a controversial exhibition where the community of Harlem wasn't involved in putting together this exhibition. And it wasn't presented as an art exhibition. It was presented almost like natural history in some ways. It had a lot of issues with it, and there were protests around it from the community of Harlem. And we know he must have crossed those picket lines. So he was concerned at the same time with how he was photographing Harlem, and probably eager to put forth his own counter narrative of that, as were the Comoinge photographers who were photographing Harlem in the same time. And there are a number of photographs of them as well in these photographs. As Hinda hinted at, there's color. There's not a lot of color, but what's there is really beautiful and shows the same kind of interests in signs, crafts of freedom, liberty, home, but added on top of that is this amazing eye for color. And we don't know if what was in the archive was all he photographed, but what was there was really rich and shows this almost kind of joyous take on Harlem. At the same time, in 1968, which these photographs all date from, in the months leading up to Martin Luther King's assassination and the months just after, he's on the road traveling to America, to several different cities. And there's not that many Black photographers who are taking road trips in the history of photography. And so this work that he made is quite important. This is in Cleveland, that had one of the first Black mayors in America. Mayor Stokes had just been elected when he was photographing there. This is in LA. That's Stokely Carmichael, member of the Black Panthers Party. He had attended. This is a kind of Black Panthers training session. This is also in Los Angeles. This is in Chicago. This is outside of Memphis, Tennessee. This is in the rural South, where one of the only places that he returned to multiple times over the years. He was interested in farming. This is a Black-owned farmers co-op in South Carolina. That's okra in the summer. He was at the sanitation worker strike in Memphis. He was seemingly kind of everywhere at this particular year. He was, sorry, I'm having some trouble moving the mouse. He was also at the riots that were surrounding Martin Luther King's death, as well as at Martin Luther King's funeral. So that is a pretty incredible set of travels that he did at a very particular time in the United States. At the same time, he's continuing to photograph in New York. So he was doing that work in Harlem, but also photographing on the streets, mainly in Midtown Manhattan, where a lot of tourists are coming together. And this where he's shooting here, it's not so much about the community. It's much more a kind of classic street photography that we were seeing in the archive. He definitely has an eye for race and race relations and inequality. He was very interested in protests of all different kinds. And then just really amazing photographs and characters that he managed to capture on the streets. And this, it was interesting to see at the foam exhibition that you use that color paint, because we were looking at this color potentially as one of the background colors for the cloth material that will go on the book. This is just an early cover that we're looking at, using that idea of the true America that he captured in the sign. And we love this image because it speaks to Harlem, but also, you know, you're not sure exactly what he means by the true America. It's something you want to pick up. And we especially like that dog on the cover. So that's where we are with it now. It will be coming out in the fall, and we're kind of desperately trying to finish it at this point. And I've only shown you just a little bit, but that's a very different take than he was doing in South Africa. So I hope.
Thank you so much, Denise, for sharing that. I mean, I'm really looking forward to seeing the book. And it was really fun to see sort of part of that process that you went through in editing it. Now, Oloremi has written an essay for the first publication that you talked about, for the reissuing of House of Bondage. And I would like to invite her to share some of her research with us that she's done extensively on the work of Cole. So please take the floor.
Thank you, Hindu. Good evening, good afternoon, and good morning, everyone. I'm recognizing that we are all spread out over the 3 continents that Cole himself had called near and dear. So, you know, the fact that we're zooming in between Europe, North America, and the African continent means a great deal to me. I'm going to be a good old-fashioned art historian and read and give you some pictures. I hope that's okay. So allow me to share my screen. We'll start with blank. So my remarks today give a sense of the mark of a man, the political and photographic imprint that Ernest Cole left on this world. I use the word mark deliberately, playing on its grammatical possibilities to speak to recent manifestations of my lifelong commitment to Cole. The first is mark as noun, in offering an excerpt of my essay in the reissue of House of Bondage, with thanks to Denise and the whole Aperture team for the invitation, entitled Black Spots, Photographic Specters. The second is mark as verb, in moving from page to exhibition space, giving an entry point of sorts to the kinds of conversations and considerations that my colleagues, Associate Curator Lucy Gallen and Newhall Curatorial Fellow Caitlin Boer, I know Caitlin's on the Zoom with us today, and I had in the process of making a collection gallery on the 4th floor of MoMA dedicated to Cole's work, which opened earlier this month and will be on view for a year. So in my mind, it functions as a kind of extension to the kinds of conversations initiated by Aperture's important reissue and FOAM's watershed presentation of Cole's work, which I had the pleasure to visit earlier this season, and really, truly, bravo to all of you for pulling off a monumental feat. So, as ever with Cole, I start with a poem by Curator Willie Kitotitile. Blessed are the dehumanized, for they have nothing to lose for their patience. False gods killed the poet in me. Now I dig graves with artistic precision. So seen under a microscope or through a loop, an offset printed photograph is an accretion of black spots. These half-tone dots form rosette patterns swimming before the eyes, suffusing planes of white space beneath. The spots flood the field of vision until the lens is removed and the image becomes whole. Black spots are the matter of a photo book, the means through which pictures take form, transformed from the printing plate onto a rubber cylinder, and then again onto the sheets themselves. Page after page, these black spots of ink fill the surfaces of the publication. Huddled close and sequenced strategically, they form a visual narrative. In House of Bondage, Ernest Cole defines a black spot accordingly. A black spot is an African township marked for obliteration because it occupies an area into which whites wish to expand. The township may have been in existence for 50 years and have a settled population of 25 or 50 or 75,000 people. Nonetheless, if the whites so decree, it can literally be wiped off the map and its people relocated into government-built housing projects in remote areas. Here, black spots mark Black communities soon to be specters. Cole's House of Bondage conjures them photographically, making visible the myriad forms of violence embedded in everyday life under the apartheid system. Deftly harnessing image and text, Cole mines the grounds upon which Black life in South Africa during the 20th century was surveilled, regulated, and subjected to forms of punitive existence. His lucid analysis and sophisticated visual grammar produces a blistering critique that reverberates not through the register of the spectacular, but rather through relentless documentation of so-called unremarkable scenes. With each image and caption, Cole wages an undeniable case against apartheid, fully formed and solid in its manifestation. Replete with haunting images and searing testimony, this landmark publication is one of the most important works of 20th century photography, and its shadow looms large in histories of photo book making. I dare say it continues to do so with every passing day. Through almost 7 years of photographic work, as Hinda mentioned, Cole traversed the infrastructural and architectural, spatial and social environments of South Africa, picturing its police, its miners, its hospitals, its schools. In structuring House of Bondage, Cole methodically deconstructs every aspect of racialized life in South Africa through photographic sections, each of which he introduces. These sections function poetically and politically, an iterative ode for those who have neither the luxury nor the inclination to perceive such modes as separate. Yet House of Bondage itself is a fugitive object, the work of a photographer who had seen South Africa with resolute clarity and recognized the creation of his work necessitated fleeing from his country's hold. As such, the book is as much the product of transnational subterfuge as it is one of prolonged photographic study. Cole secured a passport under the guise of making a pilgrimage to Lourdes, which always reminds me of my grandmother, and fled South Africa for Europe in May 1966. He arrived in New York in September that year, having spent prior months in London, Paris, Copenhagen, and Hamburg, sharing his pictures in the book dummy with interested parties in Paris and London offices of Magnum Photos, as well as Stern, Paris Match, and the London Sunday Times. While settling into the swing of life in the US, Cole came to grips with his new environment, slowly creating a body of work about Black American rural and urban experiences, which Denise really beautifully outlined for us, and I cannot wait for the arrival of that book into the world. Grasping the palpable parallels between concepts generated deep-seated discontent for Cole, but also provided a space of solidarity and photographic affinity with his Black American peers. Notably, Cole sat in on critiques with the Kamwenge workshop and is remembered by Danny Dawson as a photographer who knew how to reduce a photograph to its essential elements, be they graphic or political, leaving us beautifully crafted living artifacts of the human condition. In August 1967, House of Bondage was published in North America. The book unfolded into a moody, dark dust jacket that framed the book somewhat sensationally, as you can see on the bottom left, with the tagline, "A South African Black man exposes his own pictures and words, the bitter life of his homeland today." Beneath the book was bound in cream-colored linen, as you'll see on the right. That is my issue, my copy of the original issue, or as my father would say, his copy that I stole. And I think that's really important to a generation of photo book readers, the fact that it continues to be a fugitive book, even within a family. As you can see, was emblazoned across the top right corner with the title House of Bondage, debossed in gold. Magnum worked in tandem to serialize the story widely throughout the world. In France, the US, Germany, Great Britain, Italy, Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Japan, referred to in distribution sets as Being Black in South Africa. Predictably, as has been mentioned, the book was banned in South Africa in May 1968, months after garnering rave reviews in the US. Despite this formal prohibition, I feel it's important to mention that the book still found its way into the homes and hands of photographers throughout the country. As a finished object, House of Bondage elegantly demonstrates the means through which apartheid submerged all aspects of life. Graphically, the book is concise yet expansive, exquisitely defined in its articulations of interminable terror. The treatment of pictures in the photo book mimics the editorial layout with which Cole was familiar in his magazine work, recalling the mid-century photo essays for which magazines such as Zonk and Drum were well known, the latter where Cole worked as a darkroom and then layout assistant. Double-page spreads feature full bleed images. As Denise has teased, this is the image that you're going to see a couple times in this presentation. The open maw of the ravenous apartheid machine, engulfing blurred figures of young men scrambling in their commute and punctuating the steady flow of photos tiling across open sheets. Incisive captions are nestled below and alongside image pairs, trios, and tableaus whose columns and rows transgress the midline fold across left and right-hand side pages. So in this way, we can perceive a nuanced interplay between Cole's aim to encompass as much information as is photographically possible, while cultivating a particular kind of attention on the pages of the publication. As a result, the emotive force of House of Bondage emerges through its resistance to spectacular forms of violence and a refusal to portray the Black South African in a position of static victimhood. These images resound clearly in their renderings of life saturated completely by domination. The book's title, right, House of Bondage, refers to what Flanipa Mokoena has defined as among the many phrases and terms that may be called apartheid's past vocabularies, which are the ideological, philosophical, and historical analyses deployed during apartheid to either assert its righteousness or delineate its injustices. Engaging the negation of Black subjectivity as his site of photographic production, Cole revealed the paralyzing paradox at play when one's home, the place we know best, is the root of alienation. He exposed these structures with the express hope of bringing about a reality wherein such a space might offer something different for Black life. In kind, Cole is the quintessential South African photographer's photographer, both conceptually and through the making of his legacy. The country's twin pillars, Santu Mofokeng and David Goldblatt, sustained strains of Cole in their approaches, perhaps most directly in their attending to spatial politics, both emerging for a documentary tradition akin to Cole. These photographers are revered for their wedding of rigor with empathy and a shared belief in the power of the image being irrevocably tied to the marshalling of language. Mofokeng deploys these forms to delve deeply into the interiors of Black life across South Africa, reveling in the mercurial movements of the spirit and the soul. In turn, Goldblatt embraces spatiality as an organizing principle, working to inspect the suffocating structure of things within the apartheid system, its white supremacist phantom limbs extending onwards through time. Now, with its publication, House of Bondage initiated a tectonic shift in photo book making by South African photographers. And here I include just a little taste, including and among Peter Magubane's Black as I Am, David Goldblatt's In Boksburg, Mikhail Subotsky and Patrick Waterhouse's Ponty City, and Zanele Mokoli's Faces and Phases, among many others. So whether obliquely or acutely referenced, none of these publications exist without Cole's House of Bondage, right? They don't come to us without Cole coming to us with a courageous commitment to the photographic medium and the photo book as a generative form. Yet when the Apartheid Museum opened its doors in Johannesburg in November 2001, more than 30 years after the publication of House of Bondage, it did mark the first time Cole's photographs were officially shown publicly in South Africa. Cole's images were reproduced and mounted on large-scale sheets of dye bond, as you can see here on the top left. And that's really how I first encountered his work as a Nigerian immigrant myself, trying to make sense of a potent site of national memorialization through the country's first decade of multiracial democracy. But as I speak these words, in the city where he died, destitute and in my opinion, well before his time, I know I'm not the only one who feels this way, I recall Cole's 1968 feature in Ebony, where he introduced the images of House of Bondage, as you see on the right side, stating that they should give readers some feeling of what it's like to be a Black man in South Africa. And they may also explain why, of all countries, I should feel somewhat at home in the United States. So it was this transnational impulse and sensitivity that propelled my colleagues and I here in New York at the Museum of Modern Art to engage our holdings of Cole's work in a manner that really reflected both his mark and moved to mark his presence with a sense of precision and substance. I recall and deeply value early discussions with Lucy Gallen about the kinds of emotional and affective frequencies are emitted through the choice of a verb. What does it mean to celebrate, to commemorate, to assert the vital importance of work that documents such deeply difficult parts of our ongoing racial history, and in turn make space for a photographer who truly dedicated his life to ensuring that such images make their way in the world? So taking House of Bondage as a starting point, we worked to show not only the museum's holdings of Cole's work, but provide a polyphonic contextualization of the book's impact and conditions of production. This meant not only showing an expansive spread of pictures from the photo book, but also moving things beyond the frame. And I'd say that in a generational, geographic, and photographic sense. So in MoMA's collection are 41 works by Cole, 3 of which were acquired in 1999, and the remaining 38 ushered in by my curatorial predecessor and the current executive director of Aperture, brilliant Sarah Meister, in 2019. Of these, the lion's share are from House of Bondage, but 13 were made in New York during Cole's time as a Ford Fellow. So you see those on the back wall of this installation picture. From the foundation, Cole had secured a fellowship to photograph the rural and urban aspects of the United States, and he traveled across the country, but lived primarily in New York, as has been mentioned. So his photographs of people in Harlem show his interests in the rhythms of everyday life, uniting gatherings like church services, musical performances, and protests. Being mobile chronologically as well as geographically, we incorporated the voices of the next generation. So on the left, you see the work of Gavin Yankees, and then on the right, you see the stream of pictures from House of Bondage, taking these new acquisitions from into the collection of those who were directly informed by Ernest Cole. So here on the right, those 2 pictures are by the photographer Jeannie Mutusami Ash, who traveled to Johannesburg in 1977 to shoot stills for a documentary, but also took the opportunity to make her own photographs. In the process of making this gallery presentation, she kindly shared with us that, and I'm quoting Jeannie here, "I doubt I would have known much about life in South Africa and its apartheid system if I had not been informed by the powerful images in Cole's book. In spite of my growing up on the south side of Chicago, while segregation was being enforced in much of the country, it was shocking and incomprehensible that human beings were so utterly denigrated, stripped of basic human rights and dignity. Those images stayed with me forever and encouraged me in my personal exploration of how photographs can tell stories." So then ricocheting back to Gavin Yankees, who made the portfolio a South African coloring book from 1974 to 1975 when he was an art student in Germany, where he was driven to show his peers the past and present of life under apartheid. House of Bondage was literally one of Yankees' few resources for anti-apartheid images, and 4 of Cole's pictures appear in the portfolio, some printed in negative or repeated so that they resemble film strips. Incorporating these layers of color and also interspersing rudimentary color bars, Yankees invokes numerous meanings of the word color and underscores the absurd and dehumanizing nature of apartheid practices. So alongside these voices, we integrated printed material to give a sense of Cole's process as a picture maker and his voice strengthening with each section of the book, with deep thanks to Leslie for his cooperation and collaboration here. We contextualized his voice in relation to other photo book makers. Here on the right, with a strand of MoMA's Goldblatt photographs on the right-hand side of the wall on view behind. And of course, it was impossible to resist, including Aperture's reissue of the book. So here you see that in the bottom center of this vitrine, open to the section on Black ingenuity that Denise mentioned, very dazzling and vibrant as ever. But if we close that book, it would bring us back to the cover on an image which I will end my remarks, which also happens to be currently on view in the same room as a print. That very picture is equally at home in the context of another publication on the cover of Darby English and Charlotte Barat's 2019 volume, among others, Blackness at MoMA. So when I asked Darby, why did you pick this picture? He told me that the draw was in the way it suggests how it feels to break apartheid, even though we know it doesn't, except in a small sense, albeit a small sense that really matters, for making thinkable something otherwise very hard to think. The dynamism of the photographic composition, akin to the book itself, as I've mentioned, is in its fugitivity. In an act of documentary defiance, the blurred figures attest to the possibility of Black life that cannot be contained by the strictures of apartheid. Indeed, for me, House of Bondage is a manual for those reaching towards that seemingly impossible break, a counter to the inertia of unbelievable living conditions made believable. Resilient and resounding, it's an affirmation of Black life in a world of sustaining structures that coax and prod, insist and disavow its possibilities. With impatience and precision, Cole's images are a guide in movement and unending struggle for those grasping for light and for those gasping for breath. Thank you.
Thank you, Oluremi, so much for sharing that with us. As for the panel discussion and Q&A, we're going to have to shorten it a little bit because we went over, because people had so many interesting things to share. And some of the participants have to leave in a timely manner. So we'll just stick to like 1 or 2 or 3 questions, depending on how we go. I think my first question would be to Denise, in sort of going through all of these materials to choose and select which ones to publish. Did you sort of notice your own view of on Cole's oeuvre change as you went through all this new material? Or did you see, you touched upon it briefly, like a distinction between the way he approached the apartheid images and the way he approached his sort of street work in New York? Was it clear?
I don't know. And Leslie and Remy, please join in. I think that the life that he was living in South Africa under apartheid was very different than the life he was leading in the United States. And so the pictures he was taking in the United States are also quite different. And the kind of access he had and freedom of movement was still restricted simply by being a Black man, but was much more so under apartheid. And so I feel like it's hard to say that there's a big difference, other than I think he's a wonderful street photographer in South Africa as well as in the United States. So, but I feel like there was in some of the pictures, it feels like almost a kind of excitement or joy. And it was really an exciting moment when you're looking through the contact sheets and you see him reflected in a mirror or a window, and you realize like, oh, he's this incredible young man. At that moment, you kind of forget that. So I'm not sure if there was a major difference in style, other than we kind of see a looseness in the color work that's not necessarily present in some of the others.
Quick follow-up question. How did you choose from this wealth of material? I mean, in the case of House of Bondage, you stick to his selection, but then, you know, in the case of the newly found work, yeah, just how do you do that? It's an impossible task.
It's really difficult. And there was so much material, and it was in a kind of state of disorganization. As organized as it was, it wasn't. So we really just started by trying to figure out where he went. And then, well, what year was it? Who's in these pictures? What do we know about this time? And then tried to piece it together from there with what was he actually doing? And there are some letters and things that are describing it, and there's the Ford Foundation description and proposal. So we were guided by that as well. But some of it was just getting a feel for the material. Like, it's really obvious that he was photographing almost every day on the nice days in Harlem. And he lived on 142nd Street, but is photographing quite close to there, probably most of it's within a 10-block radius of his address. And so it's just clear he's photographing that in a way that he's trying to capture the community. And there's something different happening in Midtown. He's there, everyone's a stranger there, and so is he. And it's more of a kind of classic street photography. It doesn't have the same agenda, it didn't feel. But some of it is just a conjecture. There's no captions to these.
Impossible. What a
Leslie,
challenge.
you've been on this journey with us. I mean, would you add to that or describe it differently?
Well, of course, it took long hours to make the selection, I must say. You were in a better position to know the places. Me, I was basically clueless exactly where he was, whether it was Cleveland or Chicago. And that helped, by firstly, putting together the material into different teams, Cleveland, Washington, LA, and so on. That also helped, to make the selection, what was on the road, what is Midtown, what is Harlem. And that's how, the selection was then, done according to those specific places.
Oluremi, I heard you mention the word sensational once, and the fact that Cole was actually really trying to avoid, that kind of spectacle. But at the same time, at least, I don't know if your research mirrors that as well. I found in a lot of the press that he got at the time, and even now with the rediscovered archive, that sensational side is the one that is actually being, benadrukt, sorry, my English, emphasized. And so I was wondering if you also recognize that in your research, and how we can kind of go from this mythologized figure with a lot of blanks in his biography, and we don't really know the exact, facts, as Denise also describes. How can we sort of go about researching this figure without sensationalizing or mythologizing? And how have you been trying to sort of do that in your practice?
Thank you for that. I think it's a little bit about where you're looking, right? So depending on where you're searching, you're going to encounter particular narratives that adhere to a superstructure version that is really thinking about how to make a case for the visibility of a project. And that, I think, is what you're mentioning, right? In the sensationalized narrative of this is the book that showed the world what was happening in South Africa. But I think what has been really instructive for me has been to look to other scholars who have been doing the work with Cole's archive, to listen. And I'm thinking here about the work of Leslie Wilson in Chicago. I'm thinking about Candace Jansen, who's in South Africa. I'm thinking about Ilse Wolff, who's between South Africa and the US. She recently dedicated an entire semester of thinking with her students, making cyanotypes, right? That archetypical architectural photographic form with the blueprint, but also cyanotype, feeding into early histories of photography and Anna Atkins. And their whole semester was entitled Ernest Cole's House of Liberation, a dark room for Ernest Cole. So, these are the people and the thinkers who I take cues from, who are really important. And I think a big part of that also is with thanks to Leslie for being committed to making the materials accessible. I know that my colleagues and I, and for me when I was writing the essay for the Aperture monograph, were kind of gobsmacked by the richness of the material you can encounter on the Wits University archive, these super fantastic JPEGs. And so the fact that the material is there, that Cole's voice is there, I feel is very invigorating for a current generation of scholars who are looking differently, but also something to invite the next generation to do so too.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And I concur. I mean, Leslie, you've been so generous with Cole's legacy. There's one question from the audience for Leslie, a very practical one. Where do the proceeds of the book go? Do they go to South Africa or to an NGO, they ask?
Well, the proceeds obviously will assist the trust in preserving the work of Ernest Cole. We believe we still have a lot of work to do with, developing the archive in such a way that it can be accessed by scholars, educators, and so on. And we've been getting lots of complaints that it is not accessible. So we were working to make sure that together with the Photography Advocacy Project, to make sure that it can be accessed online, from the website of the PLP as well as from Wits University.
I think that's really something to look forward to. And I feel like, we've only really managed to scrape the tip of the iceberg, all of us. And thank you for sharing your findings with us here in the session today. Leslie, again, thank you so much for being so generous with the archive. And I can only imagine what the future will bring when it becomes available for researchers, museums, students, etc. I will hand over to my former, sadly, colleagues at FOAM now to close off. But on my behalf, thanks a lot for sharing all your thoughts.
Thank you so much, Hinde. And of course, a big, big thank you for our wonderful speakers, Leslie, Oloremi, and Denise. Thanks for the audience for joining today, and my colleague Amelie for the tech support in the background. Some practical things. The recording of this event will be online. Keep an eye out on our YouTube channel. And if you're located in or near Amsterdam, please visit the exhibition House of Bondage until June 14th. If you're located in North America, New York, visit the exhibition in MoMA. Also upcoming for us in FOAM next week, Thursday, 25th of May, we open a new exhibition called Spring Summer 2023 by Sarah Swinar. Again, anyone near Amsterdam, we really hope to see you there. And otherwise, until next time online. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.